Hello and welcome back to another episode of my Stevenson Weekender build. As I'm getting closer to finishing the boat, the checklist of big projects is done, and I find myself left with only small things to complete. So in this episode I'm going to show how I completed several of the smaller finishing touches on the boat, starting with this curved piece of mahogany trim for the transom. I started out steam bending this larger piece of mahogany around the form of USB that you saw at the beginning of this video. The steam bending went pretty well, although I did have quite a bit of spring back after I let the clamps loose. But it ended up working out okay in the final product. I made the initial cut to match the shape of the transom on the bandsaw and then used this compass to mark out the appropriate width for the final piece. I then used the router with a 3/8 inch round over bit to round the corners of the piece to match the rub rails on the boat. After getting some varnish on the piece, I clamped it in place and it'll be held there with epoxy and screws. I didn't show it on camera, but I ended up plugging the screw holes with wooden plugs so they'd match the rest of the board. Here I'm cutting off that lower rub rail that I'd left long so I could use it as a clamping point to bend that top piece down. Also on the transom, just above the stern block, is this opening for the rudder. I thought it looked kind of rough and ugly, so I 3D printed this piece of trim to dress it up some. I didn't show it, but I also touched up the paint there on the stern block. Next project is the start of the paneling finish work on the inside of the cabin. As you can see, I started with poster board pinned in place with push pins and then cut that to shape. Once I had the template shaped and taped together, I brought it down to the shop and laid it out on the paneling. This may or may not look easier than it actually was. It took quite a few tries to get the shape just right. But once I had it bent around the curve, I used clamps to hold it in place while I got some screws in. I then rough cut out the window openings and used a flush trim router bit to match the paneling to the window openings. On the cabin bulkhead, there was no curve, and so I used this VHB tape from 3M to attach the paneling to the bulkhead. Here I'm using that flush trim router bit to cut the paneling to the shape of the cabin opening. And this is a small piece of mahogany trim that I cut to match the curve. I got that put in with glue and 23 gauge pin nails and then put in the straight pieces. Here I'm getting the hinges put on the hatch at the back of the boat that covers the steering cables. There wasn't much to that. I used a router and a chisel to make a mortise for the hinge. Then did the same thing for the hatch on the front deck of the boat. This is an idea I had that was not in the plans. It's a 1.5 inch wide by 1/8 inch thick piece of aluminum, and I'm going to attach to the keel to protect it from the trailer, and if I were to run up on the shore or hit a rock or something, to keep the wood from getting as damaged. I first placed a piece of butyl tape down the center of the aluminum piece of metal and then attached it to the keel with screws. After I got the piece completely installed, I came down each side of the aluminum track with some butyl caulk. The caulk and the tape may be overkill since this is going to be on the trailer a lot of the time, but I wanted to protect the screw holes from the water. Last project I'll work on this video is the opening to the cabin. I'm going to get it trimmed out and then get the companionway cover made and the sliding hatch for the top. I started by making 2 curved corner pieces for the cabin opening. My goal here is to end up with a piece that's 1.5 inches high by 3/4 inches wide, with a rabbet on the back side that will overlap the opening to the cabin. Here I'm using a rabbeting bit in the router table, which I slowly raised to the final height needed. Once that rabbet was finished, I could take the piece back to the bandsaw and cut out that inside radius. To finish this piece, I'll take it back to the router table. I've now installed a 1/4 inch roundover bit, and I'll round over all the corners. Next I'll make 2 straight pieces that will mate up to the curved corner pieces I just made. As you'll see in a few seconds, these pieces run forward and aft in the cabin opening. Finally, I'll use this curved piece of mahogany that was left over from making the transom trim to make the arched piece that runs along the front of the cabin opening. This started out fairly easy with just gluing 2 pieces of that curved scrap together and then rounding over the edges like I did on the other pieces. But getting the rabbet cut in the back side of it was a little more tricky because my rabbeting bit was not big enough to cut the whole thing in one pass. I had to make the first couple cuts on this sketchy setup with the palm router. I have a spiral bit in that router and was able to use the fence of the router to follow that top line of the piece of trim. Once enough material had been cleared away by that initial setup, I was able to go back and use the traditional rabbeting bit to clear out the rest. Once the pieces were completed, I was able to cover them with some varnish, and then I got them epoxied to the cabin opening. I'd left those straight pieces long so then I can come back with the pull saw and trim them to exact lengths. For the companionway cover, I have the original piece of plywood that was cut out of the cabin bulkhead back when I was building that. I'm going to get that piece of plywood trimmed out, and this is the first of the pieces that was around that. I wanted a little finger hold space on this piece of trim so it'd make it easier to grab it on and off of the cabin opening. I cut that with this cove bit. The other pieces for the companionway cover trim were just straight pieces, so I didn't show those being made. This is the hatch cover for the cabin that you saw me bake back in episode 13. Here I'm installing a little bit of decorative beadboard just to dress that bottom side up some. I'm using stainless steel drawer slides to create the sliding action for this hatch, and I needed a way to cut straight edges on this curved surface, so I threw together this quick template that I could use the flush trim router bit in order to cut away some of the excess trim from the cabin opening. This will allow the hinges to set down on the roof of the cabin. Here you can see the stainless steel drawer slides on the bottom of the hatch. I was very pleased with how this worked and how it turned out, but as you can see in this shot, there was about a 7mm gap under the forward edge of that drawer slide. So I decided I would 3D print a wedge-shaped piece of trim that would hide the edge of the drawer slide and also fill up that gap. I just recently got this 3D printer, and so far I'm having a lot of fun with it. It is the A1 from Bamboo Lab, and I'm using PETG filament. You can see here in these shots how that'll hide the edge of the drawer slide. You may notice that these pieces don't look exactly the same as I showed just being printed. This was actually the second version I created to include that little bird's beak piece on the forward portion that I designed to help keep water from accumulating behind the drawer slide. My plan is to put some sort of locking latch between the companionway door there and the sliding hatch that will lock the two together while it's on the trailer or while I'm sailing. In the end, I think this turned out pretty well. I'm going to keep knocking out these small projects, and hopefully we'll have this thing done pretty soon. But I think I'll stop this video here, and I hope you'll join me next time as I continue to build the Stevenson Weekender sailboat.